About 2 years ago, Retroid released their original Pocket Flip. The rounded handheld was their first stab at a clamshell, and showed quite a few rough edges. The internals struggled with GameCube emulation, the hinge obstructed access to shoulder buttons, and the circle pads, well, more than usable, weren't quite as precise or controllable as full-size sticks. All in all, I appreciated what they were going for, but the myriad small complaints I've had since my initial review have resulted in it primarily sitting on a shelf unless I need to compare it to something. That's why, when Retroid announced the Flip 2, I was excited for another clamshell, but a little cautious. For companies other than Nintendo, clamshells have historically been difficult to pull off, with a mixture of interesting designs and questionable hardware. Fortunately, I ended up having nothing to worry about. The Pocket Flip 2 is so radically different from the original that it might as well have been made by a different company. In fact, while it still has its flaws, I'd say it might be the best sub-$300 handheld I've used to date, not made by Nintendo or Sony. To unpack that a bit, let's start with the design. When closed, the Flip 2 looks almost reminiscent of a larger DS Lite, albeit with some added ventilation for a fan. The unit feels a bit heavier than a DS Lite as well, more compact and substantial to hold than many of these similar types of budget handhelds. It's easily pocketable, with the textured shoulders and analog triggers lying flat to help prevent unwanted snags. I've taken a few walks around Chicago's north side with it in my pocket, and it's felt even less noticeable than my iPhone 16 Pro Max. For those looking for an easy device to travel with, the Flip 2 should be an immediate contender. In terms of I/O, there's a headphone jack and a single USB-C port around front. Right next to the USB-C port is a microSD card slot. That's only worthwhile to note here because the flap over it is kinda a pain to maneuver when inserting or ejecting cards. Most folks will probably insert their card once and forget about it, but it's not the most comfortable experience for anyone wanting to use multiple cards. When opening the device, the hinge feels smooth at the start with an eventual snap to its primary position. Thankfully, Retroid followed Nintendo's lead this time and sat the hinge atop the control deck instead of behind it. As a result, I've had no more issues with it covering the shoulders. Love to see it. The 1080p 60Hz 16:9 AMOLED display is plenty bright for indoor gameplay and works fine outdoors when reflections aren't a problem. At 5.5 inches, it's just about the perfect size for a pocketable handheld. Any bigger and it might feel clunky, any smaller and certain games might feel less comfortable to play. There are some notable bezels around the display, but the black colorway I have helps them feel a bit more natural. It's all very cozy. Below the display sits a control deck with a layout reminiscent of a Wii U gamepad. The D-pad and action buttons feel soft, yet springy, with clear feedback at their actuation points. Despite the typical height restraints of clamshells, each action button also has a surprising amount of travel to it. It all feels about as good to use as a full-size controller, which has kept me excited to try new games on the system. Similarly, the embedded LED-backed Hall Effect sticks feel surprisingly good. Given my experience with the Ayaneo Flip DS and Miu Flip, I expected the Flip 2 sticks to be a real downside to the device, but no, the Flip 2 actually beats out both handhelds for stick feel. Part of that has to do with the placement of the sticks. Aligning both sticks at the top, similar to a Steam Deck or Wii U gamepad, with face buttons diagonally below, feels like the correct layout for a clamshell handheld. Sticks and buttons feel easily within reach of my thumbs without additional effort. Meanwhile, keeping the right stick at the top allows for more comfortable motions, while keeping my thumb in a neutral position. Also, it's worth noting how much of a difference good stick caps make. Both sticks are the typical half-height sticks used on other budget handhelds, which don't usually feel too great. However, here, the stick caps have extra texture around the rims, which make them a bit more tactile and allows me just a bit more grip during use. It's a small detail, but that small detail really elevates my perceived quality of the input. I hope other manufacturers are taking notes. Other manufacturers should also take notes about this software experience. Retroid's genuinely created a launcher that I enjoy using, and I have yet to feel the need to dismiss it in favor of the basic Android 13 app layout. At startup, the first thing I see is a menu of system folders directed toward my ROMs. It's incredibly easy to boot up the system, pick up a game, and get going. Everything feels streamlined to reduce the amount of time I need to spend hunting for my game or emulator of choice, and I appreciate it. If needed, they also include an easy app drawer that automatically loads any installed software. This too can be reorganized into easily navigable menus to fit my needs. At no point have I ever felt lost or like I couldn't find something I was looking for, which is a sign of quality design. In the best way possible, the whole thing feels like a handheld console at the level of a Steam Deck, in which a streamlined experience is available, but there are enough menus and options to customize or launch software outside that experience if needed. Though, as much as I've enjoyed the experience, it's not entirely perfect. The system menu doesn't have default options for newer emulators, like those for Wii U, Vita, or Windows. I can create those menus myself, but the process is overly involved to the point where I've just not wanted to bother. I'd love for this UI to get to a point where I could point the launcher toward an installed emulator and say, use this app to launch anything in this system folder. But we're not quite there yet. In a similar vein, the entire setup process still takes a ton more time than some folks might be looking for. Retroid's initial setup streamlines installing some recommended software like Dolphin and Aether SX2 or RetroArch, but the software doesn't come pre-configured to work with built-in controls. As such, I had to spend quite a bit of time going to each emulator individually and remapping controls. It's not unexpected, but still demonstrates a weakness typical of Android handhelds. Also, as a much smaller complaint, while the UI is great to navigate with controls, Retroid somehow baked in a need to double tap to navigate by touch. Given how Android behaves on any other device, it's a bit jarring and more than a little confusing. None of this stops me from enjoying the overall experience, but they are some usability quirks you might want to keep in mind if you buy a Flip 2 for yourself. Of course, even the most comfortable controls or best software are meaningless without solid performance. Unfortunately, the Flip 2 doesn't disappoint there either. On this channel, I've previously described Snapdragon 865 smartphones like the Galaxy S20, LG V60, and ROG Phone 3 as more than enough for most folks' emulation needs, even in 2025. The Flip 2 continues that trend and exceeds it with additional performance profiles and an internal fan. 5 years after launch, the Snapdragon 865 is still more than good enough for emulating Wii, PS2, GameCube, and earlier, up to 1080p, or else the edges of their respective emulators. Whether playing Mario Kart Wii or Ratchet & Clank, gameplay feels smooth, with rare dips in performance associated with the game's loading textures. On some other 865 or 888 devices, I've had to go back into settings on occasion to shift resolution down, but that's rarely been a problem with the Flip 2. To be honest, it's still a bit surprising how well most games just work without any additional tinkering. Even older systems feel decent here. Typically, I'd copy and paste the same sentiment here about 16:9 displays, creating large black bars around 4:3 games, yet actually they're hardly noticeable here. The positioning of the display above my hands keeps the black bars in my periphery while playing. Plus, the OLED display allows it to blend in so well with the bezel that it all kind of feels natural. Where the Flip 2 might struggle a bit is with the more demanding emulators that have released over the past year or two. And I emphasize might, because once more, even where I thought the Flip 2 would fall on its face, it rises to the occasion. PS3 is probably the best example of the Flip 2's current limits. To be fair, PS3 emulation is very much in its infancy on Android and will likely improve over time. But still, that improvement will also likely take more processing power than the Flip 2's 5-year-old chipset to work well. I tried a variety of my game backups with RPCSX with a few successes. The Simpsons game crashed before starting a save file, Persona 4 Arena crashed before loading, and Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed managed to run, but only at like a third the target frame rate. At the moment, only lighter games like Rayman Legends seem possible to run at full speed. Given that those games still take a full half hour to initially compile, I'm guessing many folks won't find PS3 worthwhile on the Flip 2. Likewise, Windows emulation needs to be taken with a grain of salt. This isn't quite the device to run Witcher 3 or Horizon Zero Dawn without compromise and a ton of work. More demanding games, in general, have typically been more error than anything for me. Still, I could totally see someone picking up a Flip 2 to use as a pocketable indie machine or to play much older games. Smaller titles like SteamWorld Dig or Rayman Origins run full speed without any issue. If you've been looking for something more pocketable than a Switch Lite to play lighter games, now's as good a time as any to start building your GOG library. But not everything is a huge caveat with tougher emulation. Surprisingly, almost all the Wii U games I've tried have run at full speed without any issue. In fact, this might be the first time I've ever seen Wii U emulation actually work on Android without serious compromises. Beyond the lack of a second screen experience, of course. I'm pretty impressed. Although, note that this is still Wii U emulation on a technically lower-end device. Shader caching, asynchronous or not, will still have the habit of disrupting gameplay on occasion. cMove for Android is also still not as robust as its Linux, Windows, or macOS counterparts. Compatibility may be more limited with crashes in unexpected places. Nonetheless, the fact that I can play Wind Waker HD on an Android handheld at full speed with very little interruption is astounding. Not too long ago, this was something that required the heft of a full-size laptop-grade handheld. Now, it's in my pocket whenever I want it. And there's only room for it to get better over time. Now, to round out gameplay in general, it's also worth noting that it's perfectly competent for most native Android games. Whether you're looking to play a Ranger, Cassette Beasts, or Loop Hero, games run about as great as they could on the Flip 2. Retroid's built-in game menu even allows for quick on-screen control mapping if games don't natively support controllers. Again, this is a fantastic device for indie games, especially if you haven't looked at the Epic Game Store or Google Play in a while. There are some limits though. As with any Android device outside the bleeding edge, the most demanding games available may need their graphics quality lower just a bit. As one example, Zenless Zone Zero defaults to the lowest settings and throws up a warning message when I try to boost its settings even further. There's plenty of room to push performance on the Flip 2, but if you're the type of person who frequently plays more demanding games, especially competitive online games, it might be best to spend a couple hundred more on a more powerful handheld, especially if it comes with more storage. Zenless Zone Zero and RPCSX together take up about half my Flip 2's 128 gigabytes of internal storage. Even if it were more expensive, I really wish Retroid had a 256 gigabyte variant available for a bit of breathing room to install more Android games or apps. For now, I'm selectively deleting software as it comes. My only other complaint with gameplay experience is the fan. Plenty of games can be played without the fan running at all, but the system will start to heat up when playing more demanding titles for an extended period of time. Switching power or fan profiles automatically turns the fan on, at which point it utters a quite loud, kinda high-pitched whirl. While playing games on the couch next to my wife, even with our TV on, she immediately clocked that the fans were running. It's loud and kinda annoying, to the point where I might be cautious of using the fan in an otherwise quiet room. Although, I'm sure many folks could overlook fan noise and limited storage due to the Flip 2 kinda being the only clamshell handheld in its performance and price tier. There are smaller, lower-powered handhelds from Wii U and Ambernic, if you wanted PS1 era emulation and below. There are also larger, more powerful, non-pocketable handhelds from GPD and Ioneo if you're more interested in Steam games or higher-end emulation. The Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is really the only option in the middle of all those in terms of price and performance. At the $230-ish I paid, it's an excellent value that even beats out the alternative of buying an old smartphone with a telescopic controller. Heck, there's even a different model that retails for $30 less that swaps out the Snapdragon 865 for a MediaTek D1100. While I can't comment on that model directly, in my past experience with a similar Dimensity 7300, I found it more than performant enough for emulation up to Wii and PS2, with some extra room to spare. If that's all you were interested in, the savings could be worth it. The main benefit of Snapdragon chips is the compatibility with custom drivers that allow higher-end emulators to work better. Again, if you weren't interested in that to begin with, MediaTek may not be a bad choice. Either way, it's kind of hard for a clamshell fan to do better. But that's also ignoring the elephant in the room: tariffs. If you're like me and live in the US, all shipped items have gotten more expensive overnight, especially Chinese handhelds like those made by Retroid. For its original price point, the Flip 2 feels like a no-brainer. However, the full weight of tariffs always has the possibility to shift that price point to well over $300, which muddies things quite a bit. If the Flip 2 is exactly what you're looking for in a handheld, it's likely still worth the cost, up to a certain point. But if you aren't married to the clamshell form factor, it does creep it toward competing with more performant options that you might be able to pick up locally from a store like Best Buy, or source from an online store based in the US. That, surprisingly, includes products like the $400 Ioneo Pocket Air, or even a Z1 ROG Ally. These are kind of crappy times to be fans of consumer tech in the US, so just make sure you're getting the best deal you can, you know? Nevertheless, assuming the price is right, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 is a stellar handheld that I wouldn't hesitate recommending to just about anyone. The sleek, pocketable build feels refreshing in this era of ever-embiggened handhelds. Meanwhile, both the controls and display are excellent for providing a solid gameplay experience that I'd place at the tier of much larger handheld manufacturers. Add in the surprisingly competent level of performance, not only for expected systems, but also some of the more demanding options available. And I can't imagine folks who buy the Flip 2 needing an Android handheld upgrade for a while without a very specific need. There are some general gripes like a loud fan, awkward SD card flap, and cumbersome UI customization options. Yet, those have very much paled in comparison to how much fun I've had using the Flip 2 over the last few weeks. It feels like it'd be a tough act for just about any handheld manufacturer to follow. Those have been my thoughts, though. Now's the time when I ask for yours. Are you interested in buying a Retroid Pocket Flip 2, or have you already picked one up and had thoughts of your own? Let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video interesting or informative, go ahead and give it a like to let me know, then get subscribed for more handheld reviews in the near future. Alongside the Flip 2, I've been testing the Retroid Pocket Classic. That video will be coming soon, but so far, it feels very much like Retroid's found their stride in handheld designs and user experience. That's going to be all for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. Until next time, catch you later.